Russia is a loser in global capitalism. It's a
So this is
kleptocracy. It's a it's a gas station with nukes. Look, whatever they say, the Biden administration, they say, "Oh, Russia's nothing. It's a gas station with nukes." Well, Ukraine is nothing too. Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe by far. Extreme.
So this is the point where from here on out, we'll be talking for patrons 1 hour and 5 minutes, and we'll continue talking about the connection between the capitalist material relations and social relations, both, and the realm of politics.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Before we jump into the actual interview, I'll just say that my plan, because you have the Hillary Clinton action figures behind you,
yes,
and Trump and Obama. My plan in 2020 was to get the Biden and the Bernie action figures, and then when the nomination happened, to bury one of them.
Or burn one of them. Have you seen who's the Todd Haynes did a crazy movie with action figures of the Carpenters. The Carpenter story. Did you ever see that?
No.
Oh, it's crazy. It's like a funny film about the Carpenters, the band, but with Barbie dolls. Mm-hmm. And the whole self-torture stuff. I mean, it's like what girls do with their Barbies. They like mutilate them.
Yeah.
Right? But like a film, but about the Carpenters.
Whenever I've encountered a Barbie doll,
yeah,
it has always been stripped naked.
Right.
I've never seen one.
Right. It's like a kind of a, yeah. Hold on one second. I'm just going to comb my hair a little bit.
Okay.
I look a little bit too old.
I also need to comb my hair. It can't really do anything with.
Now you got good hair, Doug. I'm a little thinning on the top, and it's fine. I'm not very self-conscious about it, but I need a haircut. Like, I've been meaning to give myself a haircut. My clippers died, so then I had to buy new clippers, and so I haven't broken them in yet.
All right, so let's dive into this. Let me see if I can pull up the questions I asked you. We're going to talk about Moïse Pastone. I recently made a video about Jane Austen and traditional Marxism. And I don't know how successful that was as an analogy to refer to Jane Austen, but I wanted to talk to you because you were a student of Pastone's.
Mm-hmm.
You were majorly influenced by Pastone. And I just wanted to check in with you about what your feelings are about Pastone's critique of traditional Marxism, how close to the mark I got. When I talked to Conrad Hamilton about Pastone, but also in this video. And if I can figure out whether or not I should be afraid of you, Chris, because you are going to push everyone back into traditional Marxism, or whether or not you are a figure of transformation. This is how I would.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure that's an easily resolvable question, because that would have to be borne out in practice.
Right.
Right. I mean, I've always liked to put it as we need to do something like the old style Marxism, but of course it's also going to have to be different. But what we have in the last 100 years, more than 100 years, is false starts at something different. Right. That all kind of, had some promise, but fell below the original Marxist vision. And, so I did have the Conrad Hamilton interview that you did in mind also. And so it's good it's a good kind of follow-up, as well as, the video that you just did on Postone, and also the interview that you did back in the day. And I was trying to figure out, you only interviewed Moish once for Zero, right?
No, twice.
Oh, twice. Okay, so I know that I've seen both of them, but I only rewatched one of them.
Which one? Because one was about anti-Semitism.
It was not that one.
Okay, yeah. The one that matters, I think, is the one that was about his time, labor, and social domination.
Yes. Yes. And also about New Left politics, which I think is how we need to understand Moish. We need to understand him as a new leftist, as one of the best new leftists, but also limited by the new left. And, and we can say that now, 50 years on, about the failure of the new left. Because I think our generation lived under the shadow of the new left. And I was always I was in an Oedipal struggle with the new left, and not just Moish, and not just Adolf Reed, but like everybody, the Spartacists, like the whole thing, because the adult activists that I met as a young person in the 80s were all new leftists.
Right.
And so I, and others, like Chomsky and Michael Harrington and Murray Bookchin, I mean, obviously they're older, but they still, to me, essentially breathed the same spirit of the new left.
Right.
The people that I encountered were, I would say, generally speaking, new leftists in the parameters of their thinking. And there are all sorts of ways of thinking about that. There's the Cold War context, which is obviously overriding, meaning, Harrington, Chomsky, Moish, Adolf, totally traumatized by Stalinism. Totally. Right. Murray Bookchin, obviously, just everybody. My professors at Hampshire, wrestled with Stalinism. They liked new left Stalinism, but not old left Stalinism. But they also had a kind of respect for the old left Stalinists as well.
No, why did they say, like, outright, we like new left Stalinism? I just tend to doubt that they would claim it.
No, I mean, they would just say things like Che and Fidel. That's enough. It's enough to say that. That's Stalinism. I mean, the crazy experience that I had was you couldn't call Che, Fidel, and Mao Stalinists or Ho Chi Minh a Stalinist because they weren't white. I mean, of course, Fidel is white, but, he's a sort of honorary non-white person. Because the Cuban Revolution, obviously, the history of racism in Cuba is deep, and Che is obviously white. These are white Spanish people. These are not indigenous people or black people, but they were on the side of the people of color, right? So people of color couldn't be Stalinist. Only old white people, Leonid Brezhnev, that's Stalinism. And I was just like, no, this is total BS, And of course, Moish and Adolf were not like that.
Right.
They weren't craven like that.
The Stalinists today on Twitter would claim that Stalin wasn't white. Nor
he wasn't. He's a fucking Caucasian. He's a bandito. He's
right. But also, not only that, he's not cisgendered either. He's trans. That's what you find on Twitter.
Oh, this is some ML insanity. No, this is like total Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, like Mim Notes type insanity.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a joke, but then people take it seriously, right?
Yeah, it's a joke, but it's not really. In other words, it's said in jest and somehow meant seriously.
Right.
And, because, we need our heroes, right? And I've got my heroes. I mean, I'm not going to pretend I don't have my heroes. I do have my heroes. But I think there was a, speaking of Stalinism, a Maoist, Greg Lucero, who I engaged not only through Platypus, but also through my campaign for a socialist party. An activist here in Chicago. Spoke at one of the Platypus conventions, but I worked with him around the Socialist Party USA and around kind of activism, kind of para-DSA activism. He was from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, but he broke with them and then was just trying to do the same politics, but kind of on his own and with his little cult following, like his two wives, he was like polyamorous or whatever. And, and he just said to me once, Chris, I'm not interested in losers. I'm interested in winners. So he was saying, Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky are losers. I'm not interested in losers. I like Lenin and Stalin and Mao because they're winners. And I was like, they did not win. They didn't.
Right. That sounds like Trump, though, doesn't it? It's a very Trump-like statement. I like people who didn't get captured. I like
look, John McCain deserved that, though, because John McCain was a neocon war hawk.
Oh, sure.
And Liz, and Liz Cheney also, and Dick Cheney and Meghan McCain, and these people, the reasonable Republicans. No,
right.
Obviously they're much worse than Trump, and Trump's not a Republican. I mean, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, but I didn't mean to bring up Trump. Really, I just was.
No, but the masculinism. Yeah, I mean, the winners and not losers. I mean, it doesn't have to be masculinist per se, but I kind of get it. I mean, Trotskyism helps with this, which is worshiping of the accomplished fact. Marxists should not be worshipers of the accomplished fact. And that's Stalinism. Stalinism is the worshiping of the accomplished fact, and that's its opportunism, and that's its reformism. And opportunism, as a fairly sophisticated idea, opportunism doesn't mean just like the way we refer to it morally as like a kind of criminal opportunism. Like crimes of opportunity, like just personal benefit or something. No, political opportunism, which means adaptation to capitalism, adaptation to the realities of capitalism, and turning that compromise into a principle and not acknowledging it as a compromise.
Yeah.
Politics requires compromise, right?
It does, but it requires well thought through compromise. You can't just compromise all the time, and
you can't, of course, because you can't accomplish anything that way, right?
Right.
Like obviously, you can't advance towards your goal if you're always compromising. I mean, that's the other thing, is that Marxism was in retreat after 1919. It was in retreat. Stalinism is a retreat. Maoism is a retreat, and that's going to strike people as very strange. But the Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, these are retreats. They are. I mean, it's very hard for people to wrap their minds around that. But, if you just have a collapse of fascism in Eastern Europe and Japanese occupation in East Asia, and you just have the collapse of a dictatorship in Cuba, and you just sort of take over, and of course, you could say that about Lenin and Trotsky too. You could say the Russian Revolution was just the collapse of Tsarism and they just took over. But I think they were always very clear-sighted about what they were inheriting. Whereas the Stalinists had this kind of heroic, triumphalist kind of view of what they were doing. I mean, they also admitted to themselves that they were dealing with backward reactionary countries. I mean, they did, like they were self-conscious about it. They did know that they were like adapting to social backwardness in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in China. And, I'm not sure the Cubans I don't think they ever acknowledged that. And, it's like a funny thing with Conrad Hamilton, because he's your like house Stalinist now or something.
Right.
That's ablation. And, and he's just, and it's a Deng Xiaoping kind of Stalinism. It's like right-wing Stalinism. It's like on the right of Stalinism. It's not like Mao Zedong, like leftist Stalinism. It's like very avowedly like, oh yeah, you need a capitalist road to socialism, and etc. And I just think, okay, right, and that's where it lines up with the kind of DSA Jacobin like social democracy.
Okay, well, I want to like point out that go back to Conrad for a second and talk about opportunism as opposed to just straightforward error. Because, for Conrad, I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a level of opportunism where it changes what your theoretical ambitions are, or it changes your thought. Your opportunism is such that you abandon
your horizon.
Right. But it's not just that you like say, okay, we can't accomplish that, so I'm going to aim lower. It's that, that is no longer even conceivable. I reject the arguments. I reject, you just reject Marx.
I wish people would do that. I wish people would come all the way there. And almost, right? Like, obviously,
I mean, I think with Conrad, I think it's pretty close. I mean,
yeah, with
but
his article,
yeah, the critique of his article and his conversation with me, the critique of the Gotha program is about understanding what the aim is.
yeah, and also how we're going to get there.
Yeah, but right,
really, how we're going to get there. In other words, not confusing. I mean, I would put it this way, because I know, like, you have a background with the Marxist humanists, right?
Right. Yeah.
And also, you're engaged with Moishe Postone's work, my old teacher, and I, of course, was a student of Moishe, and I had a lot of conversations with him about all sorts of things, like over many years. And, they would have in common this idea that Marxism, traditional Marxism, was like a Lassallean workers' party with Marxist verbiage. Right? That it wasn't really Marxism. It was more a kind of Lassallean socialism, like a kind of state socialism, state capitalism, state socialism, like a kind of militant, working class based kind of Bismarckism, basically. And I kind of feel like, yes, it was, but you can't leave it at that. In other words, Rosa Luxemburg, I always like to say this, like, I have an article on Rosa Luxemburg, and it's called Rosa Luxemburg and the Party, because people usually don't think of Rosa Luxemburg as a party person. They think of her as a spontaneist or quasi-anarchist, but she's not. She's a party person. And, one of her most famous photographs, she's flanked on one side by a picture of Marx, a portrait of Marx, and on the other side by a portrait of Lassalle. And she wrote about Lassalle being, really important and a hero of the workers' movement, etc. They were aware, right? They were self-critically aware of the Lassallean nature of the party, inevitably. In other words, that Marxism didn't come up with anything new politically. It basically tried to add a kind of critical self-consciousness to an existing movement. And understand the reasons why the movement was the way it was. It's why I say Marxism is the critique of socialism. It's not to be the best socialist or the best communist. It's to be the critical self-consciousness of this movement. And that's where, the quotation that I sent you from the manifesto, about the economic nonsense of the workers' demands in the revolution, that basically they're acknowledging it, the way in the critique of the Gotha program, like labor vouchers won't work economically, but we're still going to have to do them.
Yeah,
we're still going to have to do them because the workers are going to demand it.
Yeah, I mean, he speculates. I mean, that I would hardly call that the most important thought that Marx had, that we would.
But it's all integral. It's a very short piece. Marx is a genius. He's a genius. I mean, he's a brilliant. I mean, he is. I mean, look, he's the greatest revolutionary thinker of all time.
Yeah.
In terms of historical self-consciousness, understanding capitalism, modern society. I mean, he gave birth to a movement that was the greatest revolutionary movement of all time. Right?
Well, I mean, yes, and yet also that movement was already taking shape, as you point out, and had other contributors to it. And he was a critic of that. He was a critic of that movement.
He was a critic of that movement. And that's what made him such a brilliant revolutionary thinker and strategist.
Right.
I mean, he's basically been accused of being bound to his time. Like Moishe is like, well, Marx himself is a traditional Marxist because he's kind of bound to his time. And then the anarchists accused Marx of appropriating them, like appropriating the Paris Commune. And
I thought Postone's position was Marx started out more tied to traditional Marxism or socialism of his day, and through the process of his work became a deeper and deeper critic of socialism. And
well, I mean, yes and no. I would say that yes, there is the idea of the mature Marx, and there is, Moishe was unhappy with the Communist Manifesto, but he also acknowledged the brilliance of it, meaning that it's not like you throw out all the formulations in the manifesto. You don't. Absolutely not. Moishe would not do it. He would keep it, but he would say, and I would say that Marx matured not only theoretically but politically, because it's after the manifesto that he comes up with the dictatorship of the proletariat. He has to have the actual experience of the 1848 revolution in Germany and France, in order to understand the nature of the revolution more. But it's amazing how much they do already understand before the revolution. And I think that comes from the recent historical experience. It comes from looking at Chartism, looking at the July Revolution of, the preceding generation, looking at the Proudhonists, like the critique of Proudhon, the poverty of philosophy, is like a serious work that you'd be hard pressed to show how the insights of Das Kapital are not already there. And so I don't think that, in other words, but Moish would also say, critique of the Gotha program is great, but he would say, still limited by the historical moment. So because what he said to me, so there are two formulations I'd like us to keep in mind from Moish. One is that traditional Marxism is necessary, but it's insufficient. Meaning, he said, yes, of course the workers have to take state power, and of course they have to expropriate the capitalists, and of course they have to try to institute generalized social planning. And it's not going to be shop floor or workplace democracy. It's not going to be syndicalism. It's not going to be anarchism. Like, that's all necessary, but it's insufficient. So we have to do all of that, but it's insufficient. And the problem is if you treat that as sufficient to achieve socialism, rather than necessary precondition, but not sufficient.
Chris, some of the people watching this right now will not have listened to the conversation with Conrad. And they won't have seen my video. So briefly, I just want to state what traditional Marxism is, as I understand it.
For Moish.
For Moish. So most Marxists start from the premise of liberating or realizing labor or workers from the forms of domination, oppression, and exploitation that are imposed upon them by the capitalist class, which are conceived of, the next step, capitalism as a mode of production, is conceived of as a system wherein private ownership and market forces conspire to distribute both capital and commodities unfairly and unequally. That's the second definition. And the third part of traditional Marxism is that communism is thought to be necessary to overcome the contradiction between the exploitive character of distribution and the massive productive power of labor. So those are the 3 points. And now I think many people might hear those and think, there's nothing wrong with any of that, right? I mean, but
there's nothing wrong with any of that.
Right. But on the other, no,
there really isn't.
Except that the 20th century state capitalist formations demonstrated that that capitalism and even exploitation can continue where in a system where the market is fully regulated and ownership is no longer private.
They didn't really demonstrate that, though. I mean, in other words, what they demonstrated, so the first thing that I said was necessary but insufficient. The second formulation from Moish is that Marx's insight into capitalism is born of his historical moment. So he's bound to his historical moment politically and socially in terms of what he can conceive, but he has insights beyond it. And the insights beyond it come from Marx living through the constitution of industrial capitalism and the workers' movement for socialism. That because he was there at the beginning, he could see the end. Right. And I agree with that generally. In other words, Marx would not be Marx if he hadn't been a child of the 1840s, meaning if he hadn't been a young man coming to full consciousness at the historical moment, the first crisis of industrial capitalism historically. And again, that's the objective circumstance. The subjective circumstance is that there's an emerging proletarian socialist movement that accompanies that objective change of the industrial production crisis. Now, so, Marx is very clear. It's not distribution, it's production. But then the question is, how do we understand that? Right. And I think that in the quotation from Moish that you just read, distribution of commodities and of capital, really important. Right. And so it's really about, if we were to put it in very general non-Marxist terms, allocation of social resources. Right. And what Marx observed and what we observe is that the capitalist state does a lot of that now, right? Does allocation of social resources, They do, not only jobs programs, but they try to incentivize capital and disincentivize capital in various ways. They interfere in the market all the time. And, this is why a lot of like post-Marxists or like late Marxists will say things like, well, there was always state involvement in the market. The market never existed without the state. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was never any free market capitalism anyway. And, old style Marxists would also point that out.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, how do we understand why Marx still haunts us? Because, we do have to step back and say,
yeah, but you can say that there was never any free market capitalism anyway, and still hold on to the idea that what is wrong in society is the way the market imposes an anarchy onto distribution.
And yet it doesn't. In other words, there is.
Well, I'm not saying it does, but I'm saying you can still say the one thing. Oh, there's never been a free market, and thank God for that. Chomsky says that.
Oh, sure.
Right. But on the other hand, you can still believe that it is the private.
That's he's an anarchist, though, meaning that he, of course, is focused on the state.
Right.
Right.
Well, okay. Well,
no, really, that's the reason why. Because he wants the state's the source of everything.
Right. But he also believes that
capitalism is the creature of the state rather than the state being the creature of
capitalism. Yes, I understand. But if he conceives of the market in the abstract, operating on its own principles, he thinks it would just become a power struggle. It just become chaos. It would just be warlordism or something like that.
Right.
But the point here is that we
have a problem living in neoliberalism, meaning when I watched your conversation with Conrad, I thought, okay, really the problem is that we're so spellbound by neoliberalism that we have a hard time distinguishing between neoliberal policies and capitalism, right? Because neoliberal policies didn't create this form of capitalism. Capitalism created neoliberalism in the same way that it created the preceding Fordist Keynesian capitalism. Now, it didn't create it in the sense of like, humans were involved, like humans responded to circumstances. Maybe I'll put a third Moish quote on the table, which is that his great fear was that we wouldn't get out of capitalism, but we would oscillate between statist and market forms. That we'd be stuck oscillating between. And he saw me, because I was a Leninist, and, he didn't accept my challenge to reinterpret Lenin. But he saw me as part of like, okay, neoliberal capitalism is just going to produce a new statist turn out of its discontents. And, Chris and Platypus, they're just like reanimating the corpse of traditional Marxism. And he was like deathly afraid of that. But he saw it as like an objective tendency that this would happen. And I just thought,
why was he more afraid of that than he was of the DSA? Because I talked to him when the DSA was in its home.
Safely domesticated, meaning the DSA is part of the Democratic Party, and so it wasn't going to be.
Was New Deal America, was Fordism safely domesticated as well?
Yeah.
I mean, well, okay, but
in other words,
but nonetheless, it was the same dynamic. It was the same dynamic, right?
Yeah, but it was politically. So this is the difference. Like, I feel like you focus on economics and value theory, but there's a whole realm of politics.
Right.
And what I would say, the problem with Moish and the problem with you, extreme naivete about politics. And not like capitalist politics, but socialist politics. In other words, socialist politics risks being a counter-revolutionary force. If it didn't take that risk, it couldn't be a revolutionary force. Like, the precondition for it being a revolutionary force is that it risks being a counter-revolutionary force. That's
right.
it.
But my question about why would he accept the DSA still stands even more so based on what you just said, because it's clear to me that
counter-revolution.
Right. Well, right. Like the DSA is so clearly counter-revolutionary.
Well,
it doesn't take the risk, right? I mean, It if you just by saying it's domesticated,
right,
then that obviously shows that it's
Moish was a right social democrat. You've interviewed me about this before. He was a right social democrat. Like Conrad said, he wasn't an ultra. He's not a left communist. He's not a council communist. He's not an anarchist. He's a right social democrat. And there's a certain incoherence to Moish's politics. So
yeah, I mean, once you say, I mean, like, you cannot be a right social democrat and hold with Moish Pistone's vision of what it takes to create a new society.
Check it out. It's about creating a new society. Moish said once that it took hundreds of years for capitalism to come about. It might take hundreds of years for us to get out of capitalism.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Right.
And so therefore, we're just going to muddle through in the meantime.
Yeah, so you're just choosing what form of bourgeois capitalist politics you think is safest, and that's always going to come down to what's in your self-interest wherever you are.
And that goes for you too, Doug. In other words, I do think, the gauntlet that I threw down at the Sublation launch party about petty bourgeois intellectuals. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know I'm petty bourgeois.
Not because of class status or anything like that, but because of the vision. Like, if we are in a position of being theorists and political thinkers, and we allow ourselves the illusion or vanity of, if only we were in charge instead of these capitalist economists and politicians, things would be better. And that's the DSA, right? And yet there's no threat of that. In other words, Moish understood very well. In other words, it's like, if you want young people jacked up on leftism, which version do you want? Yeah, DSA is what Moish wants. That's cool. Like, and Adolf's the same way. Adolf's the same way. He doesn't want people to be ultra, even though he's kind of ultra. In other words, he's a coarse council communist. I mean, he is, right? But he thinks now, politically, the task is social democracy. It is. Right? That is the task. We want a better form. What they wanted, what Moish and Adolf wanted, they had insights based on the New Left, based on a discontent and a reality of a Keynesian Fordist capitalism that has disappeared. And so unconsciously, what they wanted was the reconstitution of that so that they could pick up and proceed from there. Right? In other words, and that's the DSA vision. In other words, the idea
that was Chapo's vision.
Yeah.
Too. I mean, explicitly, they said it out loud.
Ben Burgess, it's like the vision is...
Ben Burgess, no, not so much. But Chapo, yeah.
But the idea is that you want people paid more, you want them to have more leisure time, you want more social safety net, and then we can struggle for socialism. And it's like, look, the old socialists, Lenin, Luxemburg, Eugene Debs, they struggled for socialism in abject conditions. Abject conditions. People were working 6 or 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, like a brutal form of capitalism. They were able to organize millions of people, working class people in the core capitalist countries. It's not like you can't do it unless people have higher wages and more leisure time. You can't, like, the workers can't organize. No, that is completely untrue. Right? And obviously, you go around the world and you look at, where there are socialist parties and communist parties that are working class based in newly industrializing countries and under very poor social and working conditions and political conditions, they organize anyway. And so, but again, they do have this idea that first we want progressive democratic policies and then we can struggle for socialism. And my point is, I'm not sure that we're going to go back to that, right? At all. I don't think that's really possible. And that is not a precondition, and it's actually leading in the wrong direction.
Why isn't it possible? Why can't we go back to it?
Well, because we kind of never really had it. And this is where the identity politics people come in. Because they're like, well, yeah, maybe the straight white men had high wages and a social security, safety net, and leisure time. But look at the bottom of the working class. Look at Black people. Look at women. Look at immigrant labor. Right? And then you're going to see the seamy underbelly of the golden age.
But that claim that's an empirical claim. That's not just a political claim. or a
But
one
it's a
based on
political
separate-
claim in the context of the new social movements.
No, but if you take it from it is a political claim, but it is an empirical claim first and foremost. It is saying,
and it's true.
It is claiming. Well, is it? It's
yes,
claiming that
black
the amount of
the auto factories were paid less than the white workers.
Sure, but it's claiming that
their jobs were less secure.
Right, but it's claiming that the total surplus created in the post boom after World War II was reliant upon
it's a component.
Inequality.
It's not
of the inequality between races or between genders, and that without it, or between countries. Well, between countries perhaps, but the point is like
neocolonialism.
Right. I mean, obviously, the uneven development between nations is seemingly precondition for capitalist development in any nation. So yeah, I completely agree there. But the point is that if you start to say, okay, it is impossible, then for those conditions to return, well, first of all, we have to ask, what do we even mean?
Well, the United States was never a Scandinavian country, and it was never going.
Okay, right. Yeah.
And even the Scandinavian countries had the Laplanders, and they had, Eskimos, and they had immigrants, right? And it's kind of invisible, right? And in other words, there was a reserve army of labor. It's not like
are you suggesting that the reason those divisions internally were there was because profitability simply demanded it? That in order for
it's a precondition for the constitution of wage labor. It's like whether you talk about the primitive accumulation of capital or the ongoing accumulation of capital, it never exists without a reserve army of labor.
Right. Okay. That I understand. We just got to be. I'm just trying to get you to be specific as to what the claims are here.
Politically, so the one thing that stood out for me in your interview with Moish from Zero Books back in the day was he said something like, the political strategy cannot be the old socialist strategy of class unity, where you try to squelch other struggles as divisive of the working class. He said that with respect to the new social movements, but he also said, but of course we don't want particularism in the new social movements. And I'm like, then basically you're left with the Democrats. You're left with an alliance of the working class and new social movements. And guess who facilitates that? The Democrats. Right? And the reformed Labor Party, the constituency Labor Party politics of the 70s, and generally speaking, the social democratic parties of Western Europe did do this. They became new leftized. They did incorporate the new social movements as a kind of alliance with the working class.
Well, let's talk about the new socialist movement, the new social movements. Were those social movements primarily aimed at cultural change?
Sure, they're anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, this, that, and the other. I mean, they also obviously had like a kind of utopian dimension, like new ways of life, new gender relations, new sexual relations. Even multiculturalism has a kind of utopian dimension to it. The idea of a kind of, it's a liberal vision, it's pluralistic culture. It's never meant to be entirely national particularistic. And, insofar as it was, then it was nationalist, and then people called it rightly fascist. In other words, Black Panthers condemned cultural nationalism as Black fascism. They were right. It's not a serious threat except to cadre on the left who get assassinated by such people, right? But it's not like a serious social threat to, like, I don't know, white people or something. No, obviously, but it's a threat to a nascent movement of socialism. It is. It's divisive. In other words, when I heard that, I was like, Moish, he's dead. But, I just, I carry on my internal dialogue. I was like, what is this? And again, like DSA Jacobin does the same thing. They're like, well, we're not PC. We're not into identity politics, but, we need to have a people of color caucus and this and that. Right. And we can't ignore racism. And it's like, yeah, but what does that mean, really?
Well, it seems to me that if you're talking about a politics based on anti-racism, that you would probably try to aim at legal solutions or policies that protected minorities. That
it's going to be on the basis of the capitalist state's management of these things, protected classes.
Right. So, like protecting their right to employment, protecting their right to housing, and then there gets to be a level where when you're trying to impose policies to change the culture, where you come into conflict with civil society overall. You can't have civil society and have the state encroach as far as people might want it to.
This is why the old way that the left dealt with these things. And, the Eugene Debs way, which is maligned as like colorblind racism or something. But even, what the Communist Party actually did in the 30s. So they like endorsed black nationalism, like a kind of black belt thesis. But in practice, they didn't really follow that. That's not how they organized workers. They organized them interracially. And, when they aimed at working class unity, they paid some lip service. The problem is now we're not dealing with working class people at all. To get back to my petty bourgeois stuff.
Right.
We're not talking about the working class at all. We're talking about the terms on which petty bourgeois intellectuals are going to agree and be part of a unified left. And I just want no part of that. I'm not interested in that.
Do you think that's what Sublation is aiming at?
Sure.
The company?
By default. It
by
is.
Default.
I mean, and that's fine. I'm just saying beware.
Well, the vision of Sublation, I was one of the first people to really turn to YouTube as a part of this.
Oh, you mean BreadTube?
I think I came around right around the same. Well, I think it was like there was BreadTube going, and I came around from the left. I mean, I don't think BreadTube really came from the left. It came from.
Oh, I guess I think of it as a left thing, but
right, like there was a philosophy. There was something like Philosophy Tube and a guy named H. Bomber guy, and what they were doing is like cultural criticism. And those were the people. Yeah, and then we showed up, and I don't know when Jacobin started his YouTube channel exactly, but the point is, by going to YouTube and to Twitch, I'm not aiming to talk to college professors or future politicians. I'm trying to talk to people
students.
Who are, I guess, the students, right? But I think of it
future professors.
When I started Diet Soap back in 2009, the people who would listen to it were generally like 28 to 35-year-old underemployed men.
Oh, sure, the millennials.
Yeah, right.
Oh, really?
Right. Yeah.
Right. In other words, freewheeling bourgeois of the liberal professions who are excluded from employment. That's how Adorno described intellectuals.
Well, I mean, one guy was his job was he would load vending machines. There were some.
Yeah, they had to take. Look, a lot of young people have to take working class jobs.
You're saying that I'm still aiming at the D class A, not at the actual working class.
No, there's no working. I mean, we're not talking to the working class. Let's get real. I mean, I'm from the working class, and I know we're not talking to them. We're not. Just
right. Even if they're union organizers,
union organizers are staff. And those are petty bourgeois. Those are petty bourgeois do-gooders. Those are not the workers.
Mm-hmm.
And, that they try to organize their own unions within the unions. And, of course, they have to be beaten down because, it's like a staff union is like breaking, the solidarity because it's like your interests as staff as against the union, right? Because, of course, the union exploits the staff. They do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, it's a big mess. I mean, all of that is not a problem if you have socialist leadership. Then you handle these things and you understand that you're making sacrifices and you're putting interests aside with the goal of socialism. But as long as unions are just a racket, which is what they are now, then no. There's no reason.
But you say that you're not interested in the petty bourgeois politics and trying to get a consensus amongst the political class, the left.
PMCs.
Right, the PMC leftists. And yet the Platypus Affiliate Society is chock full of Ivy League Ivy Leaguers and
we're realistic.
Students.
We're not organizing the working class.
But you're not interested in organizing on the level you are. I mean,
I'm interested, but not through Platypus. I knew the Platypus would never be an instrument for that, ever. I knew that.
So it was an instrument of just
You know that
keeping those people out of the left, basically.
You know that I didn't come up with platypus, right?
Right.
If my students didn't recruit me to platypus, it would never have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to hem it in terms of via negativa. We're going to provide an educational resource for our members and for the broader interested young people public of the left. If you want to know why the left is so fucked up, we're going to curate it and show. And we're going to show the historical baggage. We're going to show the historical legacy. We're going to show the history for this. How did we get to this point? And we're going to do it, the reading group is about, this is what everybody cites. And then our public fora, this is what they are. And do you see the contradiction there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Between the people who call themselves Leninists today and Lenin? Mm-hmm. Or the people who call themselves Luxemburgists or Council Communists or whatever, and Luxemburg. People who call themselves Marxists and Marx. Do you see the difference? Mm-hmm. Right? And even the people who are into the Frankfurt School. Do you see the difference between them and the actual Frankfurt School?
Right.
Right? And via negativa, just understand this is how and why the left is dead. So it's meant to serve a negative function, dissolving ideological obstacles. It's meant to, yes, disenchant young people from the left and Marxism. Let it go. Don't be a Marxist. Absolutely. Or if you want to be a Marxist, you're going to have to do something else. You're not going to be able to do it this way, which is this ideological struggle sessions, endless ideological struggle sessions over some crackpot idea about what the capitalist state should be doing instead of what it's doing now.
Right.
Or some kind of sour grapes, they nothing that they do can ever work. No, it's going to work. It's going to work for a little while, and then it's going to stop working. But it's going to work. Absolutely, it's going to work. I mean, Doug, I know that you think that the end is here. It's not.
I don't. I worry the end is here. I don't think it's here.
Well, of course they can always do stupid things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not over.
Well, okay, so my scenario, and I probably put too much energy into this scenario, is that because of the economic crisis ending neoliberalism, because of the failure of neoliberalism, there'll be some sort of turn back into national sovereignty, into some sort of quasi-Fordism, maybe without the welfare state or with more of a authoritarian. Yeah.
But
right.
The welfare state was authoritarian, remember.
Right.
Highly.
Right. But I mean, it's like you could have the authoritarianism with a lot of starvation or something, without the protection.
And there always were.
So that could be the solution, but also the competition between nations you can see it as clear as day. It's happening in Europe. It's happening, between Russia and China, and the United States. It's happening. So you can see
it is. I was just getting into an argument with someone in Platypus today where, I was saying Putin and Xi are weak. Right. The authoritarianism of Putin and Xi is an expression of weakness.
Oh, absolutely.
And this Platypus member was like, I don't see how you can say that. Look at how strong they are. Look at how they're doing this, that, and the other thing. And I'm like, yeah, but watch. In other words, there's not going to be some new China, Russia-based capitalism that's going to supplant Western Europe, Japan, and the United States, and South Korea, and Taiwan.
But there could be a terrible miscalculation, and
the only thing. What I ended up saying was the only thing that Putin and Xi have are nukes,
right?
Because their militaries are a joke. In other words, of course, they have millions of people in uniform, and they can put on a good parade. It's a joke. Not to say that the U.S. isn't also a joke militarily. It is, but it's less of a joke than theirs, right? And so, if it comes down to it, they look good on paper militarily, but the only thing that they have is nukes. And
I recently had an argument with someone in Sublation, similar. I said the reason the Soviet Union was allowed to collapse into warlordism and just get picked to pieces by foreign capital was because of the weakness of the U.S. state, because of the way neoliberalism was.
You know what I thought at the time in 1989?
What?
When it was happening? I thought capitalism is going to bite off more than it can chew in the collapse of the Soviet Union. In other words, it's an opportunity for capitalism, sure, but basically what, Poland, very few countries have actually benefited from the collapse of communism.
Right.
Right. And now, of course, China is this other example, right, of this deliberate capitalist road and blah, blah, blah.
But you have to remember that this happened at least halfway into neoliberalism. It was after the collapse of Fordism. The nation states had a completely different kind of role in propping up capitalist development than they had when World War II ended. And
you know what, Doug? Though, check it out. There's the glorious 30 years, the Trente Glorieuses, right? The golden age. But actually, capitalist economists, you know what they say?
What?
That the greatest period of economic growth in world history is from the 80s to the 2000s.
Well, which ones and on what basis? And are they financialized?
No, everybody. Left, right, center, everybody.
Because of China, because of the development of China?
And also because of the U.S. picked itself back up. I mean, the U.S., really did do something. And, so there was a serious stagnation in the 70s. And they did come back up from it. They did. And, and it's sort of striking because it's like, okay, is this just a kind of a just so story? How are they calculating this? And, but no. And it's, the global decrease in poverty, right? So it's like a global thing. It's everywhere. It's not just China by any means.
But you can't measure the success of capitalist production in terms of the reduction of
absolute poverty. Why not?
Absolute poverty.
What else are you
because you're going to measure in terms of abstract value. You're not going to measure it in terms of use value.
Oh, check it out. But they will use money numbers to prove the point.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not going to resort to caloric intake or something.
I just know that that there is a book out from Michael Roberts, who's one of these kind of value theory Marxists, showing that since the 70s that there's been a consistent decline in profitability, as an overall trend,
worldwide,
the long depression worldwide.
So you got to leave out India too. What about microfinance? Do we forget these things so quickly from the 90s and 2000s?
Take a look at the book. But this again, these are empirical claims. They're not theoretical claims. I can't justify them off the top of my head. But my question is, why do you want to say that? What is it? What is it about my little just story?
Capitalism out. Don't count capitalism out.
Oh, I'm not. But the question is, what is required for it to overcome the?
There's enough destruction already. Enough destruction already. I mean, look, we had a whole unemployed generation, the millennials.
Mm-hmm.
There's enough destruction already.
Yeah.
Right? They don't need. That's capital destruction.
Right. Oh yeah, because when you destroy the working class, you are destroying capital.
Yes. And so it's a mistake to say, overvalued assets and zero profitability, and the only thing you can do is literally blow up capital goods.
No, obviously you can devalue things in a multitude of ways. Yeah.
Right.
You are talking about a generation where you have, I don't know how many million unemployed people who are just completely checked out of even looking for jobs, living from government paycheck to government paycheck, and taking opioids, watching everything, probably maybe those are the working class people who are watching Sublation, people on opioids somewhere, and they have stopped looking for work. I hear from them.
The millennials we know, though, are middle class. In other words, we don't hear from the millennial working class very much. We hear from downwardly mobile millennial middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like the people that I know on the left, not just in Platypus, who are struggling to make a living, their parents are fine. Right? Mm-hmm. So they're just struggling to get out of their parents' house, or they're struggling to start a family, or they're struggling, to hold a job consistently, and or they're struggling with gigs, but they're downwardly mobile people. I mean, the working class is just mute. The working class just doesn't exist. I mean, they don't even vote very much. I mean, they just don't exist. They're crushed completely and totally. And they'll just accept. I mean, I have been, married to a working class person. Before that, long-term relationships with working class people. They work third shift. They sleep in the car for a few hours between shifts at different jobs. They just accept anything. They don't exist in the public sphere at all.
Right.
And yet they are producing the goods, and they're producing the value too.
I've had working class jobs. I worked at Comcast, in the telemarketing room. I know I hung around with real, honest to God, working class people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, in other words, people, this is how they live. And they're just...
I told one of them I was writing a book, and she looked at me like I was crazy and said, "Why the fuck are you doing that?"
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not because she didn't ever like reading. It wasn't because she was some illiterate. It was just like, just wasn't on the radar for something that people...
Not even on the radar. Right. Just totally right. And so, I mean, I just think that, again, I've been very realistic about what I'm doing in Platypus, and very aware of the limitations. And, people are made uncomfortable by that because it sort of shows up the pretense of the left, which, the left is a pretense. And, they just are what they are. They're wannabe Democratic Party politicians. They're wannabe corporate management consultants. They're wannabe academic intellectuals. And I've always been aware of the fact that, academia was not going to be a path to, like, socialist politics influence or something. I mean, I guess, like David Harvey, whatever. But, who's he talking to? Who's he influencing?
Jacobin readers.
Nobody that matters.
At best.
From my standpoint, right? So again, a proletarian socialist politics would have to be constituted before it can be transcended. And it's not going to be transcended before the revolution.
When I started the Diet Soap podcast, it was really an autodidactic project. And it remains one, really. So for me, I'm always just my only real litmus test is, have I learned something from this guest? Have I figured something out a little bit more? I think that it's been a couple of years since I really felt like I was making headway. Honestly.
Well, there's lots to learn about now. I mean, we are in the doldrums right now, right? Like, obviously that Biden, I mean, this is the worst presidency ever. People thought Trump was.
I would still say Bush was the worst presidency ever.
No.
But we'll see. I mean, no, wait, why am I saying that? That's crazy.
Yeah.
No, of course Biden is the worst president ever.
Yeah. I mean, it's an abject failure. And
on the basis of, like, oh, well, Bush brought us into two wars that were entirely unnecessary. And then I step back. Well, Biden is putting us into a situation
much worse.
The threatened world war is a possibility here. That is.
I mean, what he's doing is, I mean, basically, it's like we had kicking the can down the road. We had for a while with George W. Bush, with Obama. And, they can't do that anymore. And that's how Trump came in. Trump came in, no, we can't forestall this forever. And, we do need something different. Like, we can't just be confronting China and Russia. We have to play China and Russia off of each other. And, and by the way, I mean, Biden has kind of unified them against the United States, but their conflict of interest with each other, China and Russia, is greater than either of their conflict of interest with the United States, actually.
Right.
So, the triangulation, the realistic foreign policy is going to prevail. But the problem is that it's a unipolar world. It still is a unipolar world. And so when there's a vacuum, power fills it. And guess what the power is? The United States. In other words, the United States can't help itself but support Ukraine and this and that. Like, like it gets sucked in. It can't help but
don't you think there was an opportunity at the start for a negotiated settlement before there was even an invasion? I mean, maybe I'm really naive, but what Putin was asking for was some sort of commitment that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. And
Sure,
no one in the United States, in the blob, no one in the Washington Consensus wanted Ukraine to join NATO. Not right away, if at all.
Right.
So why not give him what you already want yourself? Why? It's very they wanted that invasion.
This is super basic, right?
Yeah.
Which is that you can't reward Putin for invading.
No, but this was before he was amassing troops.
Right. Well, you can't give in to him under threat either. No, seriously. I mean, it's a kind of a. I mean, the world does sleepwalk into these things. I mean, and it's political. Right. It's not capitalism. This is politics. This is like, World War I, type stuff. Now, the difference being that, Russia is not Germany, World War I Germany. Mm-hmm. I mean, China, I guess, might be, but it's just not. It's not the same situation. Again, militarily. I mean, basically, the threat of nuclear war is it's like a bluff, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not from the U.S. though. By the way, I mean the U.S. is the only country that ever used nuclear weapons,
right?
And the U.S. is likely the country that will use them. Russia and China, no, because they'll just be destroyed completely. The U.S. is going to dangerously think, you know what, we can do this. Right. So they, I remember the Clinton administration and the Obama administration contemplated nuking North Korea. Not wiping it out, but destroying their facility, their underground facility. And they thought about doing that with Gaddafi in Libya because he had an underground chemical weapons.
And Bush also said that nuclear weapons were on the table when he started going into Iraq.
Yeah, and they are on the table. And the U.S. has them forward deployed. I mean, they have tactical nukes. They have their submarines and their cruise missiles and the aircraft carriers and everything. I mean, so what these countries like Russia and China having nuclear weapons announced to, or North Korea or Iran trying to get nuclear weapons, it's basically like, how do we keep the U.S. from nuking us because the U.S. might, right? And so, I mean, the problem is that, the U.S. might nuke them to prevent them from using nuclear weapons. Like, in other words, it's a kind of a unipolar world still. And so you just have these sort of chaos at the edges, right? And there was an interview with Putin by Oliver Stone on Showtime, and I watched it. Mm-hmm. And, Putin just said, it's hard for the U.S. to do this, but they just have to let us have our own sphere of influence because the U.S. can't govern the whole world and it can't govern Asia. It just can't. It's going to want to try, but it can't. And so the U.S. just has to let us take care of business in our area. Mm-hmm. And we're not looking for a conflict with the U.S., but it's like the U.S. can't help but try to manage everything, and it can't manage everything, and they just got to let us manage our area. Mm-hmm. And look, the Ukraine war, what was going on between 2014 and 2022? 8 years. Mm-hmm. There was a civil war in eastern Ukraine going on. Mm-hmm. Neo-Nazis versus Russian nationalists. Breakaway separatist Russians being fought by neo-Nazi militias. 8 years of that. There are people in Russia, of course, the government, but also other people supporting the Russian nationalist separatists in eastern Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Somebody had to do something. Russia, the central government in Ukraine, how are you going to resolve this? Really? And the U.S., by the way, was helping the Ukrainian government throughout all this, right?
Mhm.
And, and it's like there was this war. It didn't start in 2022. There was a war going on already. And it just escalated, And, so Putin was like, okay, so the only way, because, this is the way wars have to be. If you can't get the Ukrainian government to agree to not allow the neo-Nazis to squash the Russian separatists, then what do you have to do? You have to try to decapitate the Ukrainian government. I mean, it's politics. Meaning, if you can't negotiate with them, then you have to eliminate them and bring in a new Ukrainian government that will say, yeah, you know what? We don't want the civil war to go on forever, right? And if the Zelensky government can't rein in the neo-Nazis, because he can't. He's totally their hostage. Then Putin's got to do it for him. Denazification, military operation of denazification. It sounds all crazy and Orwellian and whatever, but from Putin's standpoint, he's a rational actor. Right?
I mean, I think that a lot of what you're saying makes sense, but look, we're about an hour and 5 minutes in.
Capitalism that's driving it, really.
So this is the thing. This is what I want to get to. And so we're about an hour and 5 minutes in, and I think where you and I have our differences in our understanding has to do with the extent to which I think that that it's a historically specific mediating structure of labor, abstract labor, that then sets up their politics, that then sets up the terms by which we...
It sets up a global political order. Generally, it sets conditions. And, Russia is a loser in global capitalism. It's a kleptocracy. It's a, it's a gas station with nukes. Look, whatever they say, the Biden administration, they say, oh, Russia's nothing. It's a gas station with nukes. Well, Ukraine is nothing too. Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe by far. Extreme.
So this is the point where from here on out, we'll be talking for patrons 1 hour and 5 minutes, and we'll continue talking. We don't even have to stop really, but we'll continue talking about the connection between the capitalist material relations and social relations, both, and the realm of politics. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.